So, hello and welcome. I'm Lisa, and I'm calling from the Institute for Health and Healing. And today I'll be leading just an exploration of the idea of this time we're in, the pandemic, COVID-19, and the many forms of grief that may be showing up. So any loss that we have can cause grief. So I think sometimes we think more, traditionally about what grief is, but it really kind of branches out to any area that we feel or experience loss. And the thing about grief is that one loss can also connect us with a past loss, or even one loss can kind of graph onto another loss. And so, for instance, maybe today I experience something that's a form of loss, and it can bring up feelings from something that happened several years ago. And it can kind of happen quite quickly. And so right now we're in a time of profound loss. And we might note that many of the things that we find meaningful and are attached to have been or feel threatened. We're surrounded by death, a threat to our health, loss of financial stability is another thing many experience, and perhaps we're already experiencing, and then this kind of takes it to another degree. We can have loss of rituals and traditions. And this can go from morning routines. For instance, I know some people that had morning routines where they would go to a local coffee shop and get a coffee, and that helped them start their day. And so now they're not able to go and do that. And so that, on a small level of loss, still might impact the routine they were used to in their day. And on the other end of that, we have traditions like weddings and funerals and graduations, where we had expectations of how those would go or when they would happen. And we're encountering that. We don't have control over the things we hoped about them, and we may be just in a place of grieving loss of those things. We also can have a loss of identity. So many people I know are having to kind of rework what their roles are in their family and in their work. So kind of a sense of competency and idea of self that they had continuing to shift. And overall, with a pandemic to this scale, we have a loss of security, and again a loss of a sense of control. So the first thing I want to say is that for all loss, know that grief is normal and natural and expected. Oftentimes when we're coming in contact with grief, we can feel abnormal about our response, and so that's one of the reasons why I say that. And so we're kind of left with this idea of, well, then how can we support grief and mourning, which mourning can be thought of as the way we express grief. So the first thing we want to do is acknowledge the reality of the impact of the pandemic. So sometimes we might have more of a tendency to kind of cope by minimizing or deflecting from ideas of how much it's impacting us. And so this would be just leaving some space to just note the impact. And with that, acknowledging grief. And second thing we want to do is honor the full range of feelings and thoughts that arrive with grief. Disbelief, fear, anxiety, sadness, those are things that are common, as well as something like anger and irritability. So that's something that I hear that people are expressing right now, which, of course can be connected to the anxiety component, but also that with grief we have anger from broken expectations. And so we might not be attaching that to grief when we're experiencing it, but it may be a form of grief. We also might feel guilt, regret, and loneliness. Now, for many of you, you might feel pressure as a caregiver or community member to only express certain emotions, what some people would term more positive emotions. And, that kind of leaves us with where do we let out these other emotions that might be less comfortable or unpleasurable. So this kind of step is about how do we validate that all emotions are, and they're messengers, and to look at them non-judgmentally. We can have a tendency or a myth to think if I experience things that are hard or I give them focus, they might overwhelm me, or it might intensify them. But actually what we find if we give a safe outlet to express them in a healthy way, that actually it tends to soften them, and it tends to be a relief. So ways that we might express grief, there's a full range, but some ideas can be journaling or writing, talking to a trusted and validating friend, so someone that would encourage the idea that being able to sit with this is hard, maybe not saying this isn't a big deal. So we want someone who will help us validate. If we struggle to find that, that's where therapy can sometimes be supportive, to have the space to feel all we need to feel. We can also express it through movement, music, art, even watching a movie that connects us with feelings of grief can be helpful as a place to kind of allow. And with this, the next thing we may want to do, and these aren't necessarily in order, just the way that I'm organizing them, but is to recognize our strengths and hopes and values as well. So also making space to recall fond memories. This is where people might also have a gratitude practice. And, seek to identify values and make small actions towards them. So in these times, how we express or move towards our values might be a little different. So for instance, I know some people that were volunteering, and so volunteer programs have since shut down, and they want to, it's meaningful to them in their life to do things of helping others. And so in which case, one of the things we talk about is how in their daily life might they find opportunities to move towards this value. And so if we're have a value of, say, compassion and helping, maybe we don't have the ability to volunteer at the organization where we typically did, but maybe we can make a phone call or respond to a phone call, text message, or letter from someone that we know is struggling and is having a hard time. So in that way, still working towards that, expressing that value. And I want to note here that when we're doing something like, say, a gratitude practice, we're holding it with that other practice of acknowledging a full range of feelings. Sometimes there can be a temptation to try to bypass those other feelings, say I can get rid of them if I just do this other thing. And the idea is that we non-judgmentally accept and allow those other feelings, and that this other practice complements us by seeing a both and. Right? I can recognize that I'm struggling in this way, and I can also recognize that I have these strengths, that there are these resources with me, and that I can hold both of those. And that's one of the things we do in resilience work, is to be able to hold the both and in those ideas. The next thing we want to do is be kind and compassionate to yourself. So IHH has a Facebook page with a lot of great resources that can help in this area. Some of the places here could be how we're nurturing ourselves in terms of taking care of our body through stretching, qigong, exercises, through nutrition. I also will be doing a talk on the how to manage the inner critic in these times, and have been leading some on self-compassion practices. So those are things too that we can do to take care of ourselves. And I'll talk more about that in detail in that call, but just to say how we manage expectations in this time has a lot to do with self-compassion. So are we expecting ourselves to act in ways as though a pandemic isn't happening, or to surpass expectations that we typically would have had for ourselves? And so can we soften and be kind and say, wow, this is a hard time, so how do I kind of redefine what successful looks like in this context? Other things that we can do in terms of this category might be connecting to a spiritual practice if you have one, a mindfulness practice, a grounding practice. So just ways that we can be kind to ourselves. Again, this is an unprecedented time, one that we're all having to adjust to. And so finding this the space to say, I can take care of me a little bit, when, especially if you've been focused on taking care of others. And so finally, reaching out to others to give and accept support. Really important. In grief, naturally, we might move towards isolation and reflection and inward. That is a typical part of grief. And then there's a point where we're also needing to connect with others over the common humanity of grief. During this time, many of us can have brains and nervous systems that are in survival mode. So many unknowns and threats to our attachments can lead us, to feel more on guard. And these threats have us kind of really ready for action, fleeing. And so how do we shift ourselves into a nervous system that's more relaxed? Well, one of the ways that we can is by connection. So the brain of connection is part of this brain of a more relaxed self. And so when we make efforts towards connecting with others, we're helping to regulate. As many of you know, we are wired for connection. If we think about people who have been in solitary confinement, we see what ends up impacting their bodies, their health, their mind, their morale. And so in this way, during this time of social isolation, we maybe have to be more intentional about reaching out when there might be an urge to isolate. And we are constantly adjusting. So although we might prefer in person, where we could even maybe from some people have physical contact like hugs and proximity and seeing facial expressions, we may have to adjust to video or phone. And that I want to acknowledge, that can be hard. We can acknowledge that part. It's in many ways not ideal. And holding that with, but still a way to maintain this commitment to connection and to fulfill this need we have for connection. I've also seen a lot of people in my life letter writing, so that's another way that we can be doing an action with that, anxiety that kind of tells us I want to do something, while still honoring connections to others and maintaining our support system. And so because we're all going through these unknowns, being a little bit vulnerable can help us really connect to other people in a unique way that can really foster even different kinds of relationships. So just encouraging again, finding ways of connection, and even if you're kind of feeling a little burnt out at the end of the day, thinking, is there a small step I can do to maintain connections? Maybe it's not the night where I can have a full phone call, but maybe I can reach out to someone and do an action of where I was intending just to check in or let them know I was thinking of them. So with that, I do want to say I commend you for being on the call and just taking this time for yourself and to sit with this topic or explore this topic. And I wanted to end today with just a little bit of mindfulness, because that tends to tie in some of the things we're talking about giving ourselves a space just to feel what we're feeling non-judgmentally. So for those of you that have a mindfulness practice, you might be familiar with this, but this to me is one of the biggest things that can be beneficial, is that we learn how to kind of sit and allow for feelings and to let them soften. So in my mind, the intention of a mindfulness practice isn't necessarily the outcome of relaxation. It's more the ability to accept what is. And then in doing so, those things naturally eventually do soften. So let's go ahead and try a little bit together. And so again, just invite you to settle into your chair, to perhaps adjust your spine in a way that allows breath to flow easily in and out. I invite you to put your feet flat on the floor if they're not already. Noticing if your shoulders are up by your ears, perhaps allowing them to gently drop. And from here, let's take in a nice inhale through our nose, sending the breath down to the belly if we can, if it's accessible. And exhaling fully out from our mouth. And again, inhaling in. Exhaling out. And now in this moment, I invite you just to notice any area of tension you might be feeling. So take a second to just scan over your body, maybe beginning at your head and working your way down to your neck and shoulders, back and stomach, legs and feet, and just simply noting any areas of discomfort or tension. And now with this next breath, we can visualize simply just sending breath to that area as a way of acknowledging it. So inhaling in, sending breath in that area, and seeing if we can exhale and release a little bit of that tension. Again, inhaling in, exhaling out. And now I'd like you just to simply note where in your body might there be just a neutral sensation. A sensation where we don't normally pay attention. We say, oh, it's there. So for instance, for me right now, I'll simply note I wasn't aware of any feeling in my right earlobe. It felt neutral. So seeing if there's anything, any area that you can note. And now we'll do the same thing, taking a nice breath in and exhaling out. And just simply noting that in our body we can be holding both and, an area of tension and an area of neutrality. And let's take one final deep breath at your own pace and rhythm. So I appreciate everyone being on the call today. I understand that everyone might be in different stages of grief, dealing with a variety of losses, and I'm sending compassion out to each of you. We're doing these calls daily, and so I invite you to check out ones that might continue to help you in a self-care practice during these challenging times of unknown and perhaps increased stress. I'll be repeating this topic at 4. It'll be the same discussion. And as I was saying, I have upcoming topics on managing the inner critic and self-compassion, and so I invite you to join. For the upcoming weekend, I hope that each of you can find moments of kindness towards yourself, moments of being able to allow yourself to feel what is in a non-judgmental way, and a moment of calm. I thank you all for joining me. Take good care.